So I'm going to start the session. So welcome to the session of the Mobilize Your City Mastering Mobility series. It's all about the money, secure the financing for walking and cycling in your city. My name is Verena Knöll. I'm a mobility expert at the Mobilize Your City Secretariat based in Bonn in Germany. And there I'm responsible for the capacity building and methodology development that we do in the Secretariat. And I'm also the regional focal for our member cities and countries in Africa. So this session is the third and unfortunately also the last part of a series of trainings that we did on active mobility together with the Institute for Transport and Development, also known as ITDP. And in previous sessions, we discussed, for instance, in December, how walking and cycling why walking and cycling is important and what barriers currently exist and how we could overcome them with solutions. And then in March, we also had a session on how to integrate walking and cycling in the diagnosis phase of urban mobility planning and what tools are available for that. And then, of course, in the end, it's all about the money. So today we're talking about why financing is also important to turn from the visions, from measure selection, and from the planning phase into implementation. So this will be the focus of this session, as you can see. But don't worry if you missed our earlier sessions, they are still available on YouTube, so you can rewatch them later. And that is also a perfect transition to our housekeeping slide, because just like previous sessions, also this session will be recorded. So if you don't want to appear in the recording, please turn your camera off and remain muted. And then I can assure you that you're not part of our YouTube channel then in the future. Of course, it's also recommended in general to mute yourself if others are speaking to not disturb the flow of the session. But if you have a question, you can always post that in the chat and we will then later include it in our Q&A part or directly answer it in the chat if we maybe run out of time, because we have a lot of content to cover as well. You will see that we are also active in the chat. So here my colleagues Saman Tariq from Mobilize Your City and Aimee Gauthier from ITDP will help me to keep an eye on the chat. And they will also post links and resources there during the session. And if you also have something that you want to share with the other participants, maybe an interesting article for the topic, a publication, a project, or an experience of yourself, I also encourage you to share it in the chat to, have some exchange also among participants. And to also get familiar with the chat function, I invite you to introduce yourself in the chat. So you can provide your name, your organization, the city where you're joining us from. It's also always nice for us as organizers to know who is joining this session. And while you introduce yourself in the chat, let me also introduce what we do as Mobilize Your City and what we are working on. So as you can see on the slide that I'm currently sharing, we are a global partnership of 65 member cities and 15 member countries across 4 continents. Mobilize Your City was founded at the COP21 in Paris. And as you can see in the upper right part of this slide, the partnership is co-financed by donors from France, Germany, and the European Union. And as a global partnership, we work together with our members to develop sustainable urban mobility plans that you might also know as SUMPs and national urban mobility policies, so-called NUMPs. So if you're interested in learning more about the partnership and our work, what we do and how we do it, I encourage you to visit our website and also to have a look in our recently published Global Monitor that provides a comprehensive overview of our work. But please make sure to do so after the session, because we also have some interesting content prepared that you might miss otherwise if you leave to our website now. So here you'll find more information on what we have planned for today. Our session is going to last for 90 minutes. We start with an introduction into funding and finance for active mobility before we then take a closer look at tools that can support you in securing financing for walking and cycling. And then, as usual, we also have some case studies. Today, those are from Chennai in India and Douala in Cameroon, to also provide some practical experiences and insights before we then jump to a conclusion. And this is another reminder that please mute yourself if you're not contributing to the webinar currently, because there's some background noise. So this is another reminder to do that. Coming to the objectives of this session today, we aim to convey the importance of fund and finance for active transport as a part of sustainable urban mobility planning. We also want to identify common and innovative funding sources on multiple scales, coming from the local level, national, international, and then also some other sources that are more climate-based. We also want to understand better what actions are needed to leverage those sources. So we hope that this session really helps you to also go out yourself and really secure some financing for the activities you do have planned for active mobility in your city. And to reach those objectives, I'm accompanied today by three amazing speakers. First of all, there's Jacob Mason, the Director of Research and Impact at the ITDP headquarters, who will be presenting the first part of the session. Then we have Santhosh Loganathan from ITDP India. He's the Deputy Manager for Healthy Streets and Compact Cities. And he's also leading ITDP India's walking, cycling, and road safety program. And then we also have Prisca Lablonde from the urban community of Douala. She's the coordinator of Douala's Urban Mobility Project, and she will also be sharing what they are doing in case of financing active modes of transport. And of course, there's also me. My name is Verena Knöll. I will be facilitating this session. So welcome to the three speakers. Thank you so much for joining, to all the participants. And I will directly hand over to Jacob for an introduction into the topic of today's session. And I'm looking forward to hearing about the work in Chennai and Douala later.
Thank you, Verena. I hope you can see my screen now. So is it working?
Yes, I can see it. And I guess others can also see it then.
Perfect. Okay, so again, my name is Jacob Mason, and I'm the Director of Research and Impact at ITDP's global program. And as Verena mentioned, we'll be talking about why funding and financing are important for active transport, how they relate to sustainable urban mobility plans, and then in the next section, I'll talk about some of the tools for funding and financing for walking and cycling. So to recap, in our first Mobilize Your City session, we talked about why walking and cycling are important to sustainable transport, to the transport system. And really, walking and cycling are absolutely fundamental. They are the most accessible forms of transport. You don't need to buy anything to walk in most cases, and cycling requires just a bicycle in general, maybe a lock or a helmet. And so they're available to the most people in the most places. Most trips, even by other modes, require walking as well. So even if you drive somewhere, you have to walk from where you drive to where you go. But the issue is that they often don't get the attention that they deserve. In addition, in our second session, we talk about diagnosis of the existing walking conditions and cycling conditions in cities. So if you don't know where you are, you can't figure out where you want to go. So understanding how many people walk and cycle in a city, in your city, what the conditions are for walking and cycling, can really help you to figure out what you need to do to improve walking and cycling and how to make a plan for that, which is also part of the SUMP process. And so you can find out more about that in the second workshop that we put together for Mobilize Your City in this series. And as I mentioned, for this session, funding and financing is a critical part. Once you understand where you are and the importance of walking and cycling, you need to understand how much it costs to invest in walking and cycling in order to plan which measures you want to implement based on the needs that you identified in the diagnosis phase. And then you need to secure funding to actually pay for the implementing of your plans. And so understanding what sources are available, how much is available, what the requirements are for those sources. So that's going to be a big focus of this session. And so it feeds directly into the sustainable mobility planning process. You can find more about that from some of the Mobilize Your City sources. In terms of bigger picture, sustainable transport you can see on the left is a fairly small portion of the spending on urban passenger transport. In 2015, we, alongside University of California in Davis, estimated that we're only spending about 1.3% of the total amount we spend on transport, urban transport for passengers, on walking and cycling. So just 1% is a tiny amount. To reach a 1.5 degree scenario and really avoid the worst effects of climate change, that number needs to go up dramatically, closer to 6%. So almost 5 times as much spending on walking and cycling as we do now needs to happen in the future. And then a shift from huge spending on private vehicles to more spending on other modes like bus and rail. Mobilize Your City also works on a lot of different sustainable transportation modes, and as is evidenced by this session series, walking and cycling is part of that, although it's not the biggest portion. Specific projects are being financed through the Mobilize Your City program. The noise doesn't come through the speakers. So I want to start off with the quiz. So we saw that some places, we saw how much in general overall is spent on urban walking and cycling. I'm curious to know how much you are spending in your city on walking and cycling. So if you could follow the link, it should be posted in the chat to this quiz. We can start to see what people are actually spending, and I'll leave this link up for just a sec. You can also use a smartphone to follow the image in the bottom to access the link, and then you can enter in whatever you know for your city, what the percentage is. Now, the actual presentation. So people could go ahead and start to enter in their what they spend on walking and cycling. We can start to see what the different rates are. So one person doesn't know, one person spends less than 1%. That's interesting. So maybe this also gets to 20 to 25%. That's impressive. Another person doesn't know, a bit less than 1%. So starting to get a better sense of how much is actually going to walking and cycling. And so this is all about spending, so not necessarily about funding in terms of what the projects are actually, where the money is going, not necessarily where it's coming from. So maybe take a few more moments to go through. Maybe if a few more people have some inputs, we can go through that. So just from what I'm seeing right now, it looks like a lot of people spend very little. About a little less than half people said they spend less than 1% of their spending on walking and cycling. And a lot of people don't even know how much goes to spending on, how much goes to walking and cycling. So that's an interesting data point for where we are. So thank you for your participation. And if you have thoughts, you can also put those in the chat. I'm going to go back to the presentation. Yeah, so there's a big lack of funding, lack of spending on walking and cycling in a lot of cities, and a lack of information on what's going to walking and cycling in a lot of cities. So something to keep in mind as we go forward. I want to present some data that we collected, our Mexico office collected on spending for walking and cycling. And as you can see here, a lot of the cities spend most of their money on road infrastructure and paving. The orange and the kind of greenish blue, really more green. So road infrastructure and paving are the overwhelming majority in most of the cities in Mexico that we studied. Cycling infrastructure and pedestrian infrastructure, which is gray and the reddish color, make up a very small portion in most cities, with a few notable exceptions. This changes over time, obviously, but it really gave us a good snapshot of where we are. And so, the first step to understanding what kind of money is going to walking and cycling and planning for walking and cycling is to understand what's being spent on transport now. And you can look at the report that we put together in the link, which I think we'll be putting in the chat. Compared to the other modes, however, walking and cycling don't cost very much. The infrastructure construction and maintenance costs by mode are much, much, much higher for cars and even two-wheelers for building and constructing infrastructure. And these are costs per 1,000 passenger kilometers. So walking and cycling per passenger kilometer is minuscule compared to the other modes. It just doesn't cost that much to move a lot of people on foot and on cycle. So good to keep in mind in terms of return on investment for how you're spending your money. But those costs can vary pretty significantly. On the left, we see a street that was already paved. It already had sidewalks in place, and for this project, which happens to be in Washington, D.C., cycle lanes were added with paint and these kind of flexible posts. They're made out of plastic. And these parking, they're called curb stops. They're just like a little slab of concrete that's bolted into the ground. So not a lot of money, only costs $50,000 per kilometer. On the right, however, we see a street that was completely redone. It was rebuilt, repaved, new utilities were added, new landscaping was added, new benches, decorative materials, new signage, striping. Everything was completely redone from the bottom up. And this cost more like $1 million per kilometer. So it can change dramatically depending on how you're investing and what kinds of investments you're making and what the existing conditions are before you start. We also, in our research, we know that walking and cycling investment leads to higher rates of return. So this particular graph is looking at jobs per million spent, jobs created. So jobs in terms of the construction of walking and cycling infrastructure. And you can see that compared to things like manufacturing battery cells or cars, or even battery electric car manufacturing, the amount of jobs is just much higher for investing in walking and cycling. And this is from SLOCAT data, the Sustainable Low Carbon Transport Partnership. And in addition, walking and cycling investment leads to all sorts of other benefits. On the right, you can look at the, well, let's start on the left. On the left, you can see the health benefits from more cycling and walking, reductions in diabetes, depression, cancer reduction, reductions in Alzheimer's disease and other mental health conditions. And on the right, you can see other data on positive impacts from walking and cycling, greater productivity for workers, better air quality, which leads to reduction in premature deaths. Local businesses, this is from the UK, saw up to 40% increase in shopping with better walking and cycling infrastructure. Congestion was down, and health costs went way down. So all sorts of benefits. Some of these are even harder to quantify. So a lot of the quantification doesn't even include all of the benefits. So there's really lower cost, very high returns for investing in walking and cycling. But it's not just infrastructure. Infrastructure is the most obvious. We need to be building footpaths, sidewalks, pedestrianized streets where appropriate. But we need to also maintain them. So that requires money to make sure that they don't fall apart. In the course of building them, we need outreach. We need to be talking to people to make sure they understand both what's being built, get input on how it should be built, and also reach out to people to inform them that things have been built, and so they can understand and better use the infrastructure that's there and the services that are there. On the bottom, we have bike share. So there are services that can really help to use the infrastructure that's there. Bike share is both infrastructure and service. So you need people to operate the bike share system, whether it's government staff or through a private operator. Usually it's a private operator. So you need funding to make sure that those systems are financially sustainable, and staff. Of course, on the right, you see that you need government staff and capacity in order to manage everything. So they need to be able to put out contracts for infrastructure and maintenance. They need to be able to either do outreach through government staff or pay for other consultants to do outreach, create plans, manage operators who run bike share systems, manage maintenance contractors to maintain and oversee the maintenance of infrastructure. So with that, I'm going to take another pause and do another poll. So I want to hear from you all. How many staff in your city, so full-time staff or the equivalent of full-time staff, are dedicated to working on walking and cycling, walking and or cycling. So if you can, again, follow this link, you can use your smartphone to access it as well. We'll go ahead and jump to a poll. And if you could, go for it. You can estimate. So if you have someone who's working in like some sort of like contract management, and maybe half of their contracts involve walking and cycling, half of their time is spent on walking and cycling, that would be like a half of a staff person. Or if you have like a full-time walking and cycling planner, that would be a full-time person. So I'm curious to jump in and see what people say.
May I ask a question? Is in the poll you asked about the staff of the city working for walking and cycling. It means that you mean the government staff or
yes, government staff.
Okay.
We have one with 0, one with 5 to 10 people. And the reason that I ask about government staff is that staff to be able to manage all of these various projects. So we have a couple with 0, a couple with don't know, a couple with more than 20 staff dedicated to walking and cycling. I believe in my city, it's probably in the 10 to 15 range. Okay, we're starting to see some good results. We have a number of people that don't know, which is interesting as well, and some with none, and some with quite a lot. So this is really helpful in thinking about how you're able to implement funding and financing for walking and cycling. Do you have the staff to manage contracts? Do you have the staff to take funding and direct it towards projects? Do you have the staff to monitor a operator who's running, say, a bike share system? Do you have the staff to monitor contractors who are doing maintenance to make sure that that maintenance is actually happening correctly. So all of these things require staff. So it's good to see that so many cities have a good amount of staff. And for those who don't know, it'd be a good place to start to see if you have the capacity to begin implementing more walking and cycling measures. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and move on to the next section. So the next thing I want to talk about is what is needed to unlock more funding and finance for walking and cycling. So often there are significant barriers for getting more money for walking and cycling. So political will can certainly be a big barrier. If politicians don't want to spend money on walking and cycling, nothing really is going to happen. And often that's if walking and cycling are not given serious consideration as important transportation modes. They don't get the funding that they need. As we mentioned, you need capacity. If you don't have staff that can manage the money and develop proposals, manage grants, manage contractors, it's hard to use the money effectively. Data can also be really important. If you don't understand what the costs are, if you don't understand what the impacts might be, it may be harder to secure funding for walking and cycling. There can be standards that exclude walking and cycling, and there may be formula funding from, say, a national government that only goes to, say, roadways, and so that can be a big problem in funding walking and cycling. I know that was an issue in the United States for many years. We had a highway trust fund that funded highways exclusively at a very high measurement. And then there's also some restrictions. There may be restrictions on what funding and financing you can access as a city in terms of the structure of government. So you may not have the power to tax, or you may not have the power to enact fees on things like parking or other sources of revenue that might fund walking and cycling. So with that, I'm going to move towards funding and finance tools. So I want to look at some of the typical, as well as some innovative funding sources, funding and financing sources for walking and cycling. So I'm going to talk about 4 different aspects. I'm going to talk about local sources, national sources, and international sources, as well as climate finance. So I'm going to start with the local sources. These are often the most readily available and kind of easy to enact. Excuse me. So there are 4 types of, actually it's going to be 5 types of sources that we're going to look at. You can read those below. These sources can include new revenue that you raise, as well as revenue that's reallocated from other destinations. You need to think about the authority to raise local revenue. So if you're able to actually do that, there's always political questions. So if you're adding new fees to things, there may be political implications to that. People don't always like paying for things that used to be free. And then there's also questions of visibility. So sometimes it's often beneficial to tie new funding sources to improvements that are directly related to those things. So I'll talk more about those things as we go on. So the first and maybe most obvious funding source is just from a general municipal budget, so a city budget. So you can allocate money from your budget to walking and cycling. So you can add new taxes to take more money and push it towards walking and cycling. You can move money from one other program to walking and cycling. So for example, if you were thinking about building a big highway, you could instead take some of that money and move it towards investing in walking and cycling instead. So as you think about that type of thing, you know, anytime you take money from something else, there is usually a group of people who liked that money going there or wouldn't be going there. So you have to consider the implications, the effects, who's going to be upset from this, and what kind of arguments would be persuasive to convince them that that's a good decision. And if you're raising new sources of money, as I mentioned, people don't like paying for things that used to be free. So what is a good argument, and why? How do you justify adding new, raising new funds? So some examples, in Mexico City, the city invested in the EcoBC bike share program, and 100% of the money for the capital program, the infrastructure around that, the stations and the bicycles, came from their general budget. He said, this is a priority, we're gonna spend the money on this. And in Pune and Chennai, both directed big portions of their transportation budget to walking and cycling. And in Pune, that included bus rapid transit as well. So they made the political decision to shift a lot of their spending, transport spending, to walking and cycling from other sources. And we'll hear more from Chennai going forward. And so this is just a picture of Pune and some of the things they're able to achieve from shifting a lot of money towards walking and cycling. You can see really high quality footpaths, just a beautiful streetscape as a result of shifting money towards it. Another source of money, of funding, is usage fees or penalties. So the idea behind this funding source is that you want to tax things you want less of. So congestion being an obvious one. And then you use that money to fund things you want more of, which is things like walking and cycling. So sometimes this can go, we have to be a little careful. One thing you might want less of is speeding. So you could consider putting taking money from, say, like a speed camera and dedicate it towards walking and cycling. But you also want to be careful about creating incentives for bad behavior. So in the example of the speed camera, if all of your money for walking and cycling comes from speed cameras, what happens if people get the message from getting a fee from speeding and then they stop speeding? You either have an incentive to get people to speed more and design roads that encourage speeding, or you have a system that doesn't have any more money for walking and cycling, and then you have to find another funding source all over again. So things like congestion, where there seems to be you can find a middle ground for what you want, can maybe a better congestion and parking, maybe a better source in terms of long-term sustainability. But it's something to think about and consider in terms of what kind of city do you want, and how will the funding source get you towards the kind of city that you want. So some examples, I'm not going to read all of them, but a lot of these cities have used parking revenue. So metered parking or some sort of paid on-street parking revenue then is used to pay for street improvements, bike share improvements, walking improvements. So this seems to be a really common way of funding walking and cycling improvements. So here, this is an example from Mexico City. This was the Eco Park system. And you can see on the left, before the Eco Park was implemented, there was an overuse of street space for parking. You see double parked cars. You see cars that appear to be circling around. You see double parked cars here and here and here. There's no really a way to cross the street. because the cars are parked everywhere that you might want to cross, so people kind of cross wherever. And then once they implemented the the on-street parking program, the demand went down because it was no longer free. So there are fewer people wanting to park and they parked for less time. And then the money then went, excuse me, the money then went to fund streetscape improvements, such as this widened sidewalk with landscaping, and then crosswalks to cross the street. Another local funding source can be sponsorship. So this is really commonly used for bike share systems. So the idea is a company will pay to have their name, their logo on, say, a bike share system, which funds often the construction or operation of that system. And then the company gets like advertising as a result of having their name on there. So things you want to consider, conflicts of interest within government. Are the people approving of the program? Make sure they don't have any links to the company, so they don't benefit financially from that. And also, once you have a company on kind of a government program, you're implying that the government supports that company. So you want to make sure that the company is pretty well regarded before putting their name all over kind of a city service. So there's a number of examples. You have City Bike here in New York, which pays for a lot of the costs of the New York City bike share program. There's some run by healthcare programs in Chicago. Divvy was a key sponsor of the early system. And then the Bank Itaú in Rio was a key supporter of their bike share system. I'll move on to a little bit more complicated one. This one's land value. I have like 4 names on here for this. There's land value capture, tax increment financing, payment in lieu of taxes, district improvement funds. All of these are different ways of using improvements to an area to help pay for those improvements. So the idea is that when you invest in an area, the value of the property goes up, and then you can use that value that's going up to pay for the improvements themselves. It's kind of a cyclical or iterative way of moving forward. So there's kind of two ways of doing this. One is if government owns the land, you can auction off development rights, and then those proceeds can go to subsidize housing. It can pay for infrastructure to then help pay for the actual development that happens on that land. Often this is done alongside expansion of rapid transit stations, so metro stations or BRT stations. Another way is like land value capture. So you can freeze as you improve an area, as you invest in services and infrastructure in an area, it often improves the value of the land, which if you tax land values, then that money then comes back to the city in form of taxes. So you can freeze taxes at one level, and then the additional taxes you can dedicate towards paying for a bond. You can basically get a loan based on those revenue streams. And then you can use that bond or that loan to pay for the actual infrastructure itself. You can use it to pay for walking and cycling. It's a little complicated, probably needs more capacity to do it. But it can be an important way of paying for future investments. Something to consider, if you're freezing property taxes in one area, especially an area that's about to get wealthier, and using that tax to pay for things in that area, it can kind of stop redistribution of revenue to other areas. So in an area that's getting wealthier, it's getting more services as it gets wealthier instead of serving the entire city. So something to consider as you move forward. And one example, which is from India, there's a metro rail policy that requires metro projects to include value capture financing as part of the metro proposals, and as well as to fund walking and cycling improvements as part of those proposals. So funding last mile connections to the two new metro stations as they are built. So funding walking and cycling connections. So the last thing is the business improvement district. This is also can be a little bit specific, so I won't spend too much time. But the idea is that businesses and residents of an area can decide to tax themselves over and above the regular tax rate, and then use that money to pay for additional services and infrastructure in that area. Bids, as they're often done, are sanctioned by the government. So once they're established, you have to pay to the bid. You have to pay for the business improvement district. There's no opting out of it in most cases. So, you know, as you think about this, you know, in a business improvement district, by paying more taxes, you get more services, but that can lead to less equitable investments. So, you know, you may have business improvement districts that have, you know, really nice looking sidewalks and cycle lanes, while other areas are underinvested in. And then because everyone, in most cases, everyone has to pay into the system, you know, that's extra taxes and fees. And so that can, if businesses are struggling or if people are struggling to afford rents, or they may end up being displaced. They may be pushed out of the area by the new taxes. And then a lot of these business improvement districts are not necessarily, they're not actually government, they're kind of quasi-governmental. So there's less public accountability to how they're run and how they operate. So there's an example in Washington, D.C. It's called the Golden Triangle bid, which uses taxes to make sidewalk improvements and to fund maintenance. Here, you know, here's the specific workers. They work for the bid. They have like this business improvement district jacket, and they're salting side crosswalks in snow. And there's some really beautiful sidewalks with landscaping, shrubs and trees and benches that were put in as part of their work. And this is actually a rain garden too, so it helps with stormwater runoff. So I've been talking for a while. I'm going to pause a third time for another poll. I want to hear where your city gets funding for walking and cycling. And so this one is a free form. So if it comes from just a general budget, does it come from fees? Do you get national funding? I want to hear where your money comes from for walking and cycling. And if you don't know, you can just say don't know. So if you can, again, click on the link, it should be posted in the chat, or you can use your smartphone to access the poll. So if you can go ahead, I will go ahead and switch to the. All right, we have general budget is a big one. Some have no money going to walking and cycling. Some have national funds. Activists are pulling in money in some places. Sponsorships. General budget comes in again. Municipal budget also. So we're seeing a lot of municipal budget. I see national programs, national funds come in there a lot. Advertisements and sponsorships are both on there. Okay. General city budget. Any others? is everyone able to access the, we have one with the Business Improvement District. I want to hear more about these activist collectives because that's a new one for me. We can talk about that. And I see national budget there a few more times: national funds, national budget, national program schemes, and then private sector. What's private sector investment? Okay. National budget. Okay, so I'm seeing a few more national budgets. So it doesn't get a big word because there's slightly different terminology, but national programs is on there a lot. Thank you all for sharing this. This is really interesting and helpful. I'll leave that open for just a bit longer, and then we'll go ahead and move on. Okay. Thank you all for sharing this. And if you want to add more, you can add it in the chat as well. I'm going to go ahead and go back to the presentation. And then we'll move on to national funding sources, which a lot of people have talked about in their in the poll. So it seems like this is already a big source for a lot of people in a lot of cities. So national funding sources is obviously funding from the central government in a country. Things to consider, there may be requirements to qualify for funding. There may be politics involved. Different areas may get preference depending on how the government is set up or what is a priority of the government at the national level. And you also have to think about the quantity of funding available. So in many countries, there's more money available at the national level than there is locally. So we talked about potential sources. There's competitive grants and loans, formula grants, as well as targeted funding. So we'll talk about each of those. So the first one is competitive grants and loans. So the idea is a government may set aside money for competitive programs where local regions can submit applications that are reviewed for specific projects. So there's specific criteria, what they're trying to achieve, and the process to review those to make sure that good projects are selected. So you need to have, for this to be successful, you need really good criteria so that it's clear why projects are selected. And there's also, it tends to favor cities with higher capacity. So if you have a lot of staff to put together a really good proposal and really think through it well, then you may be more likely to win the grant or a loan. So in the United States, there's a build grant that supports walking and cycling. It used to be called the Tiger Grant. And you put in applications for projects, and there's a big pot of money that can be awarded for it under under an administration. 2 administrations ago, it was much more focused on walking, cycling, public transport. Under the previous administration, it was more focused on road projects, and I imagine it's going to be shifting back towards walking and cycling and public transport now. Now I'll talk about formula grants. This is where a national government allocates money to states or cities or provinces for specific purposes, or just general, but they can include walking and cycling. And there's a specific formula that allocates money to each location. So it goes to everyone based on the formula. And that can often be better because it can fund capacity as opposed to requiring capacity to get it. So things to consider, if the formulas are really complicated, they may be hard to understand. And the national government has to have the capacity to make sure that the funds are used appropriately. Sorry to use lots of US examples, but there's an urbanized area funding formula that was used fairly recently, and I'll show you the next slide. So yeah, this is just an example of how a formula is created. So there's a pool of money for cities over 1 million people, and so the amount of money that gets weighted by the bus miles are traveled. So if you have more bus miles, you get more money. If you have more people, you get more money. And if you have higher population density, a weighted population density, you get more money. So that's like one way a formula grant is set up. And so each area gets money according to their bus revenue miles and population density. And there's more targeted funding. This can be done in a few different ways, but it can be funding from the national government for, say, a specific project or type of project. It can be like a one-time funding for a project or continuous funding, and it's often used for capital projects. So it may require specific legislation or appropriation, or it could be just a requirement that targets existing funding towards a particular source. So one-time funding can be hard to replicate. If you have a specific law that's passed to put money towards a mode or a project, passing a law, depending on the country and the political context, can be challenging if you want to try to pass a law to fund every project. So I'll talk about this example from Ethiopia. There's a non-motorized transport strategy that was adopted by the country recently, and that strategy directs national funding to be used on projects and requires them to include complete streets with facilities for walking, cycling, and public transport. So it takes national funding sources and then requires walking and cycling to be key parts of those projects to receive money. It also requires local authorities to spend 33% of their capital expenditure on walking and cycling infrastructure. So to get national funding, you got to spend local funding on walking and cycling. So there's a link to that will be posted in the chat as well. Now I want to move on to international funding sources. So this is things from other countries to a local country. These are probably the most challenging to obtain. There's more requirements and more coordination that has to happen to get them. So there are requirements. They require political support, typically from the national government, to even apply. You have to have data to meet the requirements. So you have to be able to show that you have that it's a good project and it meets the requirements for the bank to fund. And there's things to consider in terms of the quantity of financing available and the size of the project that they would be willing to finance. These are typically finance sources, not funding. So these are loans. So there's development banks and climate finance that do this. So development banks, I put some logos up here of development banks as an example. They didn't sponsor this. So this is just so you know what they are, not that they are endorsing this. So development banks provide national level loans typically for big projects, and they give below market rates, but they have conditions to make sure that they meet their development goals. So you have to meet their requirements. They have to be big enough to justify a big loan. So there's some examples. These examples are a little maybe the Philippines example is a little misleading because it is on the smaller side for a development loan, but I think the Wuhan Urban Transport Project is maybe most typical of kind of a big development loan from the World Bank for about $200 million. So often one of the challenges for walking and cycling projects is getting a project that's big enough to be of interest to a bank. So this is just a little overview. There's lots of countries that give money to multilateral organizations, and sometimes there's pass-through organizations that give the money to the multilateral organizations, and then those then distribute them to partner countries, often leveraging money through capital markets. So it's a little complicated. And then bilaterals is more just like one country to another country. So AFD, the French Development Bank, or USAID are bilateral. They just give money from one country to another. Climate finance is a little bit, it's similar, but with a focus more exclusively on addressing climate change. And so these projects need to demonstrate greenhouse gas reduction as well as development. They tend, a lot of the climate sources are looking to be catalytic. So they're looking to start projects that haven't been tried before. And so, you know, if it's something that's been done a million times, it's harder to get some of these climate finance funds. You know, and you have to show that they have a greenhouse gas impact, which can be more challenging if it's something that hasn't been done before or done very regularly. And you have to have capacity to show that they have that impact. So I put some examples here for the Poland example is probably the most interesting in terms of walking and cycling. And again, the logos don't mean that they endorse the presentation. So I put this graph up here just to show that the climate financing is even a little more complicated than some of the development financing. And there's lots of different ways that it can be raised, so where it's coming from, and then where it goes is also there's lots of different things that it's invested into. You don't need to dig into the details of this, other than to say that it comes from a lot of different places, including corporations and even individuals, as well as national governments. And Mobilize Your City has some tools to help dig through international funding sources. And so there's a toolkit that the link will be put in the chat that can help to understand climate finance in more detail. So with that, maybe I'll pause briefly for any questions. I know we've been going for a while. I've been talking for a long time. So if there's any anyone want to see if there's anything in the chat that I should look at.
Thank you so much, Jacob. I also took the time to already go a little bit through the chat to sum it up for you. Thank you very much for presenting this catalog of financing sources. I hope that you as participants also feel like that's useful. I certainly learned a lot about the different levels of where you can get funding from. And maybe, I mean, you can always raise your hand to pose a question, or you just write it in the chat. We had a discussion earlier by Trang, a participant from Vietnam, and she asked, or she shared her observation that there sometimes is a difference between walking and cycling, especially when it comes to the questions that you ask. For instance, like for people working on this topic, that maybe more people are working on walking, whereas not so many people are working on cycling. And I know that we also had this discussion in other webinars, like shouldn't we like differentiate between the two? So I just wanted to give you the opportunity to maybe comment on that. Like, why do you think it makes still sense to combine, or yeah, should you have a person like dedicated to walking, another one for cycling?
Yeah, it's a good point. There are certainly differences between investing in one versus the other in terms of the technical details. I think in terms of thinking about financing for them, they really do go hand in hand, and the types of infrastructure investments are really complementary. So if you're rebuilding a streetscape and rebuilding a street, combining walking and cycling infrastructure into that can make both better. You know, cycling infrastructure can really be supportive of people in motorized wheelchairs, and it can help clear up space from the sidewalk and the footpath. And you know, in terms of thinking about bigger investments, to really think holistically about your city, especially if you're going after big development bank funding, putting them both together in a larger package can make them more attractive for, say, a development bank to invest in.
Thank you for sharing that perspective. I think that was also a similar, view that we had also for the other sessions, that they should indeed like go hand in hand. But it's good to hear also that that's the case also for the financing part.
Yeah.
Another question, or kind of like a comment, also maybe even a new source of funding that was shared by Matteo in the chat, was revenue from advertisement space, for instance, on public transport. So, public transport and active modes should ideally also go hand in hand for sustainable urban mobility planning. And his question was if that should count as a sponsorship as well. And I think Aimee already like gave a quick answer in the chat, but I also wanted to give you the opportunity to comment on this. Like, is this a good new source of financing maybe that we should also include in that catalog, like advertisement space on buses, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, it's often important to link the source of the revenue and how it's being raised to the thing that it's paying for. So having bus sponsorship, paying for sidewalks, maybe a little less direct of a link. And you just want to think through, what the implications of that are. But yeah, I mean, certainly advertisement can be a source of revenue and has been used as a source of revenue for paying for public transport. I'm not aware of any specific one where it's used for walking and cycling infrastructure. But again, I think some of the principles are the same. You want to make sure that it's a sustainable revenue source so that you can continue to count on that. I know there was an issue with the sustainability of some of the advertising sources for some of the bike share systems that Aimee brought up. So you don't want your revenue source to go away suddenly. So maybe having a diversity of revenue sources is also important.
Sure. Thanks so much. And then there's Murillo, who just like provides me the perfect transition with a question that we wanted to include anyway. So you had asked before, Jacob, on this activist collectives, and there are indeed like some responses now. So you can check that out in the chat later, also from Bogota and also from Sao Paulo in Brazil, where some citizen initiatives are like, well, helping cities or like citizens to promote cycling, maybe teach how to cycle, give some courses on repairing cycles. And that, of course, includes like in-kind contributions, but then also sometimes like money. And there's a question now from Murillo: how can collective activists reach international funding? We're a key link in this movement to change our cities and create local and more efficient initiatives. And another question that he also has, or she, I don't know, how to raise more money for public programs, like more bicycles in schools than only infra and bike sharing systems. So a really big question maybe, but well, I'll still hand it to you, Jacob, for maybe you have an insight on that.
I would just say that it's international funding for these things is really challenging in terms of the big funding that I'm talking about. There may be some private donations or foundations that may be able to provide funding, but you're almost certainly not going to get development bank funding for an activist collective. That said, demonstrating success to local government, building a political movement for investing in walking and cycling can be huge, and showing the benefits, showing how it's really cost effective to invest in walking and cycling can be a really big motivator. A lot of cities don't have much money, and if you can show that the money is not being used in a way that's very effective, that can really change minds. There have been a number of cities that have invested in cycling education, and that's been really important at growing the number of people that are understand, walking and cycling more on a more core basis, especially if you can do that as part of the education system.
Thank you so much. Thanks also to everyone who was active in the chat, asked questions. Please continue to do so. Also share your experience, especially I think this point with the activist collectives, also something that was new or not on our list before. So share some insights if you have them. And we will also answer your questions in the chat, even though now we have to move on, because as I said, we also have some case studies prepared. And the first one is from our speaker, Santhosh Loganathan from ITDP India. Santhosh, I invite you to take the floor. I can share the presentation for you if that's okay. You just tell me next slide and I would move on then.
Sure, sounds good, sounds good.
Okay, so let me quickly get to your first slide then.
Hi everyone, just to give you some context before I go into the presentation itself, like how Jacob covered in his presentation, what the different sources of funds are. In India, the arrangement works this way. We have the national government, which is the government of India, and we have the state government. In my case, I'm going to be talking about the government of Tamil Nadu, and the urban local body, which is the implementing agency itself. In this case, it's the Greater Chennai Corporation. And we have some examples of the national funds, which is the Smart City Mission or the National Cleaner Program. And we have some examples of the state government funds as well. The Tamil Nadu Road Infrastructure Project and the Chennai Mega City Development Mission. And both these national sources and the state level sources, the fund is given as a grant to the implementing agency, which is the Greater Chennai Corporation. So they don't implement projects on their own, they give it as a grant to the implementing agency. And for that, like Jacob mentioned, there is a lot of criteria that needs to be fulfilled for them to be able to access the particular funding itself. I'll get into more details later. Next slide, please. My voice is clear for everyone?
So I think there's some kind of like audio issue, so maybe if you talk a little slower, I think that would help to understand if that's possible.
Yeah, sure. So to take an example of the Tamil Nadu Road Infrastructure Project, which I mentioned earlier, it is a fund, is a project set up by the government of Tamil Nadu in the year 2008 to repair and relay roads damaged during the implementation or construction of underground utilities. Because Tamil Nadu, as a state, did not have underground utilities like water supply or sewerage in most of its cities until recently. So to remedy that construction process, they set up this particular fund, this particular project, and this project has its own dedicated fund, which is the Tamil Nadu Road Infrastructure Fund. And this is given as a grant to the respective UIDs, the urban local bodies, on an annual basis. And this particular grant is sort of a fixed amount depending on the utilization of the previous year. And initially, this particular fund did not include provisions for footpaths or cycle tracks in it. The picture you see on the right, like that's how most roads implemented in this fund look like. Like you have the paved roads end to end with no provision for footpaths or cycle tracks, and the edge of the road is always occupied by parking. It's a very common sight even now. We still have a lot more roads like this. Next slide, please. So in that sense, the Greater Chennai Corporation adopted a non-motorized transport policy. Like ITDP closely worked with the corporation officials to inspire them to redevelop their streets as inclusive streets for pedestrians and cyclists. And Chennai became the first city in the country to adopt a non-motorized transport policy. And the policy set an ambitious goal or an aim of allocating at least 60% of the transport budget towards improving non-motorized transport, which is towards footpaths and cycle tracks and other infrastructure, and ensuring at least 80% of the streets have continuous footpaths for people to use. And one interesting side note here is that the Greater Chennai Corporation, while it's the urban local body, they only control so much of roads within Chennai. There is also other agencies who take part in the city, and this policy does not apply to those departments. So there is always a difference between, say, what the highways department does or what the metro department does and what GCC does. So this policy was applicable only for the Greater Chennai Corporation. And after this particular policy, the scope of footpaths were included in the tourist fund, which I mentioned earlier. Go to the next slide, please. And the corporation took a very progressive action from the beginning itself to see how the existing funds under the tourist program can be put to good use to develop footpaths. And the photos you see on right, you can see the difference between the previous photo and the after photo, where the improvement was not much. It was very minimal to keep the cost down because the availability of funds with the ULP was still very limited. Unfortunately, always the metric of success or utilization of funds is measured in terms of number of kilometers implemented. So the moment they include footpaths as part of the scope of work, the number of kilometers reduces, and that reflects as a poor performance from the urban local body side. So it took a lot of time for them to negotiate and make them understand, or make the state government understand that this is indeed important project for them to be implementing it, but the available cost was very low. So they only looked at surface level treatment of footpaths. It only included the surface paving and the bollards that you see on the side. It did not take into account any utilities or even something as basic as stormwater drain in the design. But again, over the years, they had a lot of learnings, and I'll go into it later. The map you see, this is the amount of footpath that's been implemented in Chennai in the last 8 years now. Next slide, please. Like I highlighted earlier, the challenges. So this is before that road was taken up for improvement. You can see there is an existing stormwater drain on this particular picture. And while this is very narrow and was not really easy for people to walk, in the next slide, you can see how the footpath was made a little bit more wider and for people to walk continuously. So this was a difference between the before and after within a period of 1 year. But again, after a few years down the line, go to the next slide, please. Because this, in fact, this footpath was not considering the utilities. When the time came for the electricity department to revamp the underlying cables, they had to dig up the whole footpath. So whatever investment was done towards the footpath, it sort of went to waste. And currently, this road, this is the status of this particular road. It's not walkable by any means. So this was one learning that everybody from the project had. And then parallelly, there were also some experiments in certain locations where the stormwater drain was included as part of the design. Can you go to the next slide, please? And it yielded really good results. Like Chennai, being a tropical coastal city, gets a lot of cyclones and gets a lot of rainfall and rainfall-induced floods as well. And this particular road, which did not just retrofit a footpath on top of a stormwater drain like the previous picture, it included the stormwater drain as part of the design. And this proved to be very successful because, one, the lifespan of the road itself improved greatly, and there was no flooding despite the surrounding area being quite inundated. So these were learnings that the corporation had, and they wanted to see how they can scale it up. But again, the lack of funding was a biggest roadblock going forward. Go to the next slide, please. So at this time only, we had the National Smart City Mission, which was a one-time national program where the national government asked the cities to apply for based on certain parameters and get a funding of 1,000 crores each, which is about $128 million US. And this was taken up, given as an area-based development model. The 100 cities that were selected were not asked to revamp the city-wide infrastructure, but rather focus on one particular area within a city, one particular neighborhood within a city, and see how that can be improved as a model neighborhood, and then scale it up across other neighborhoods on their own means. So Chennai got selected as part of this particular mission in 2015 and received funds. And one interesting thing is that this program mandated that the funds can only be used for the funds that we use, roads implemented using these funds need to have pedestrian infrastructure in mind, and the funds absolutely cannot be used for land acquisition or grade separators at all. So that was a big boost to nudge the cities in the right direction. Next slide, please. So again, coming back to Chennai, so this is the T Nagar area, which was the smart city area-based development model neighborhood that was chosen. And these are the different plans that were into consideration, like what are the different streets that can be improved, cycle sharing, how can they place the previous stations, or even connecting intermodal integration, like all that was taken into consideration. And in this, there was a very ambitious project called the Pedestrian Plaza, which was the first of its kind in the city, actually. And they wanted to ensure that this Pedestrian Plaza was built to last. They didn't want any redigging to happen in the future. And they, with all the learnings in the past, they wanted to include all the utilities as part of the design. Go to the next slide, please. So this is how it looks currently, and you have a very wide footpath on both sides, and it's bustling with activity in the evenings. And the utilities are integrated as part of the footpath, and the city guarantees that the road will not be dug up for the next 25 years. That's the kind of longevity they're looking at right now. Next slide, please. Again, so this particular exercise, where the utilities were part of the street design, was only done in one particular street in the entire neighborhood itself. And it took the city about 3 years to go from design to implementation, because there was a lot of coordination gaps. There was a lot of negotiation with other departments to ensure that the project is implemented successfully. And once that is done, it was very well received from all fronts, be it the government, be it the bureaucrats, or the engineers, or even the citizens for that matter. So the next immediate step was the city wanted to scale this up, the same model, including utilities, to about 6 neighborhoods in the city, spanning about 72 square kilometers, and 110 kilometers of key RTS streets were identified. And all these streets are bus route roads with access to transit as well. And currently, this project is in the pilot stage. They are planning to tender out 11 kilometers in this particular year, and they are tapping into another national program, which is the National Clean Air Program, and also the Tourist Fund, like I mentioned earlier, which is a grant from the government of Tamil Nadu, and their own capital funds. So this is what they're looking at right now. And because of the way this project was packaged, we received very good interest from development banks like the World Bank, Asian Pacific Investment Bank, and they have included this as part of the proposal in the upcoming Chennai City Partnership Project, which is a $1 billion project that is looking at revamping the mobility and water supply across the city. And we also had interest from the German Development Bank, but that's currently in conversation, so we'll have more clarity later. Next slide, please. So to get the interest of the development banks, which is the first of its kind in Chennai, at least, this is the first time it's happening and it's coming to fruition. The biggest advantage, or the biggest way that we were able to get this interest itself in the first place, is to start with scale and packaging. Like Jacob mentioned in his presentation, for development banks, the scale of the project is very important. Like, what kind of financing are we looking at? So this project at this particular scale was looking at close to $300 million over a period of 5 years. And that was a very attractive project size for almost all development banks. And government of Tamil Nadu and the Reddy Corporation have a good credit rating, so it attracts more investments as well. Once that is done, we have the interest of these 3 development banks with the scale and packaging itself. But beyond that, to actually convert it into a project, we needed to do a bunch of analysis to prove that this project is worth investing. That's when the calculation of IRR comes into picture. And the city needs to make a very strong case for street improvements while calculating IRR, factoring in the following points. And there are even more points, but I'm just keeping it very short here. One is the socioeconomic cost of road accidents. Chennai is one of the top cities where in India the most lives are lost to road accidents. That's number one. Second, the economic and environmental cost of road digging or unorganized utility lines. Like I mentioned earlier, Chennai faces a lot of cyclones, being a tropical coastal city, and that damages the utility lines that are going above ground, or and that's even during flooding, the utility lines gets damaged. So that's in order to avoid that, it's important that is included as part of the road design, and that's what we are doing right now. And that has a certain cost saving in the longer run, life cycle costs. And also ensure the streets are climate resilient, like be it extreme drought or extreme weather events like a cyclone or floods. The streets need to be resilient in that sense, and that also has associated cost to it. And we also calculate revenue potential through track rent. Track rent is nothing but the rent charged towards the utility companies to be using the ducts provided itself. And the on-street parking management. While on-street parking, Chennai does on-street parking management right now. Without street improvement, when you start charging people for parking, immediately they start questioning because they don't see any visible improvement on the street. But after you do a street improvement project, it becomes, the willingness to pay becomes much more higher. That's what we observe in the Clean Air project as well. And even other sources like advertisements, land value capture, etc. And indirect benefits like better access to public transport. All this needs to be included in the calculation of IRR, the internal rate of return. And to just show you an example of how we calculated for the road crashes. Next slide, please.
Santhosh, I just want to remind you of the time. It would be great if you could maybe sum it up within the next minute, if that's possible. I know it's very interesting, but we also have another speaker coming up. So
yes, this is the last slide. So this is just an example of how we calculated for the cost, the socioeconomic cost of road accidents itself. So recently, the Ministry of Road Transport and Highways of the Government of India did an analysis of what is the actual cost of a life lost in road or even injuries caused in road accidents. We got that data and took the road accident for one particular stretch and calculated how much it's costing the city for one particular year, or the life cycle cost of the project itself. And it showed to be about, if the project is implemented right, with traffic calming, safe pedestrian access and everything, it was shown to be like improving by reducing the cost by 400%, the cost associated with road crash itself. So this is one example. Like this, we did a calculation for all the factors that I mentioned earlier. I'll go to the next slide, please. And that got their interest to funding itself. That's to sum it up. And we're also working with several other cities with the Smart Cities mission, the government of India itself. And with that engagement, we were able to achieve a completed walking infrastructure of about 1,900 kilometers across several other cities in the country, and cycling infrastructure over 55 kilometers. And we also are happy to announce that over 1,500 kilometers are being planned to be improved by the next 1 year. With that, I wrap up my presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this interesting presentation, and these are certainly impressive numbers. If you have any questions, I would encourage you to put them in the chat so that Santhosh can answer them immediately, because we won't probably have time to have another Q&A round. And I would hand over directly to our next speaker from Douala, Prisca Lablonde, for her presentation on financing active modes in Douala. Now I can hear you.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. I will talk about the city of Douala, economic capital and port city. It has nearly 3 million inhabitants. We will talk about issues of urban mobility and active mobility in particular. The Douala Urban Mobility Plan and the type of funding available for active mobility in the city of Douala. Concerning the challenges of urban mobility, next slide please. Concerning the challenges of urban mobility, the main mobility issues are urban sprawl leading to the proliferation of artisanal transport, quality and quantity inadequacy of public transport services. Also, we have various actors which work in the organization of transport, but there is no coherence between these actors. The next challenge is the air pollution affecting public health and safety. These issues lead to traffic congestion. Concerning the challenges of active mobility in the next slide. In the next slide, please. Walking is the most used mode in the city. In fact, walking currently represents 33% of trips in Douala. In addition, the average travel distance is 2.3 kilometers as the crow flies, with 44% of trips connecting 2 points located less than 1 kilometer from each other. Pedestrian trips are mostly intra-zonal trips. Finally, bicycle use is currently very marginal in Douala, by around 0.1% of trips. The main reason mentioned when we are doing the household service are the road safety risk, fatigue, and the climate. In Douala, we have many rains and it's very humid. Then bicycles is very difficult. I send this image demonstrated the modal path of more transport in Douala. In the next slide, I want to present the Douala Urban Mobility Plan, which is done with Mobilize Your City. Next slide, please. The Douala Urban Mobility Plans are elaborated in 2019, in fact, to resolve the problem. We have the solution provided is the development of sidewalk and pedestrian crossing, the covering of gutters now open to the sky, the ban on bicycle riding on the sidewalk, and greater control on the use of public space. To talk about the types of funding available for active mobility in the city of Douala, I used to divide the two types. We have one which come from the budget of Douala City Council, and another one which comes from the World Bank. From the budget of Douala City Council, the mayor used to elaborate two programs. The one is called Restore to Sidewalk to Pedestrian. This program consisted in raising the awareness of informal actors to respect public space, and then in the repression and development of said spaces according to the recommendation of the Douala Urban Mobility Plan. The second program is elaborating action plan for the professionalization of transport operators by motorbike, considering that motorcycles, taxi use public space to park. The city of Douala has drawn up the said plan based on the recommendation of the Douala Mobility Urban Plan. It advocates raising awareness among transporters. It promotes the wearing of chasuble and helmets. And finally, it suggests the development of loading points in the city. These two programs being supported by the planning document. They are included in the budget of Douala City Council as quick wins. The action which have quick impact and reduce school cost activities. Another one type of funding. Please next slide. Another one type of funding is the projects financed externally by technical and financial partners. In case of Douala, we have Douala Urban Mobility Project, which is financed by World Bank. This project has three components. The first one is support of institutional strengthening and professionalization of existing public transport operators. The second one is BRT infrastructure, fleet and system. The third one is transit-oriented development around the BRT system. This project is global because it takes into account all modes of transport. Regarding the active mode, this project will finance rehabilitation of road construction along select feeder roads, including public lighting, sanitation, drinking water network, drainage, and traffic management. It will finance also identification of a key pedestrian through fab to complete a sidewalk network and on selected feeder roads. The improvement and creation of space reserved for pedestrians and bicycles as a mode of transport, paying particular attention to safety, quality, and live accessibility and enjoyment along feeder roads. And this project will also finance improvement and provision of street furniture for public transport. This is how the Douala City Council have funding to active mode. Thank you. I'm sorry for my English is not so friendly.
Thank you so much, Prisca, and don't worry about your English. I could understand you very well. And it was very interesting to also have this perspective from a Francophone country in an Anglophone context. I think we often don't have that. So thank you so much for presenting the case of Douala and how the SUMP also could help to get some funding there. I'm sorry that I have to skip the Q&A session here to don't steal too much of your time, but please feel free to post your questions in the chat. We can also answer them later, even once the webinar is ended. But I also would like to take some more time to, tell you a little bit more. But first of all, thank you to Jacob, to Santhosh, and to Prisca for their input and insights. We are now already at the end of the session, and it would be great if you all participated in this webinar could provide us with some feedback. So my colleague is going to post a link to in the chat. Let us know how you like the session, what we can maybe do better in the future. That is always very helpful as organizers. And we also included a little quiz in the feedback survey. So it's not just about telling us what is good, not, but you can also test your knowledge about what you learned in this session if you click on the link. I also wanted to let you know that there are already new trainings in the pipeline, and the best way to stay updated on our activities is if you use this first QR code here to sign up to our newsletter if you're not already registered for the newsletter. We will always let you know if there are new publications upcoming or new trainings, and then you can also register to those. If you missed our past sessions or you want to share this session that you just listened to with your colleagues that could maybe not join today, you can find all the sessions, all the trainings that we do, the recordings of those on our knowledge platform. And the second QR code is going to take you directly there. And otherwise, you can also use the link in the chat. And then I also saw that someone already asked if we are going to share the presentation. So I have good news for you. Of course, we're going to share the presentation, and not just that, but if you're interested in conducting a similar training to this, we are also currently working on making all the trainings that we have as part of this Mastering Mobility series available as replicable training materials. So if you are also conducting trainings on similar topics as we do, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We will also make all these materials available soon. But if you maybe already have a training upcoming before that, you can also write to us, and then we can maybe share some even for some pre-testing before. So here's some information how you can reach out to us. I will also put my email address in the chat if someone is interested in learning more, and we will of course provide a follow-up. So thank you to everyone for joining us, for your questions, for the lively discussion and inputs in the chat. I certainly learned a lot of new stuff here, and I hope that you also got more insights into how you can secure funding for walking and cycling in your city. And I hope to see you soon in our upcoming training sessions. Thank you so much for joining. Bye.